Thank you so much for joining. I see our attendee list going up. My name is Helena Rim, and I'm a project manager at the Local Government Commission and part of the SEEC program. So thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on local energy codes. This is actually a repeat performance of one of the highest rated breakout sessions at this year's SEEC Forum in June. So if you didn't get a chance to attend this session during the forum, now's your chance. And if you did get to attend, you'll have a chance to perhaps learn some more and ask a question that you weren't able to last time. So I'm going to give it another few seconds for folks to join before we go into the webinar participant poll before the actual presentations. We'll give it a few seconds. As folks join, I just want to remind you guys that we have a Q&A panel on your Zoom app on your screen that you should see, where you can ask questions to the speakers. There's also a chance to upvote questions that have already been asked so that you don't have to repeat it. And you can comment if you, as an audience member, feel like you know the answer or want to add on to the question that's being asked. So let's use that for 1 or 2 questions after the presentations and for our 10-minute Q&A, 10 to 15 minute, hopefully, Q&A session after all the speakers have gone. Okay. Looks like we have around 70 participants so far. I'm going to get the poll started. So before we jump in, I wanted to ask, we just wanted to ask a few questions to understand who's joining us this morning. So I'll give around 10 seconds per question and then share the results with everyone before passing it over to our moderator. So in just a second, you should be able to see a poll pop up on your screen. And it's just 5 pretty simple questions. And it should be up. So the first question is, what type of organization do you represent? And we have 6 different possible answers. Next one is, please indicate which utility or utilities serve your jurisdiction. Next is, did you attend this forum or this session at the SEEC Forum this year? The fourth question is, if you're currently considering a REACH code, what subjects are you focused on? And you can pick multiple options. And last but not least, we're asking you, what is a REACH code? Give folks another 30 seconds to go through the questions. All right, in the last few seconds here, I'm actually going to give a little bit more time because it looks like there's more people joining and taking the poll. So if you're just joining, we're doing a poll before our presentations just to get to know you guys a little bit better. All right. Let's give it 10 more seconds. And of course, you don't have to take the poll if you don't want to. Okay, I think I've been setting the time a bit, so I'm going to end it now at the 2-minute mark. Let's see what it looks like. So we have about a third of our attendees from local or regional government, and some from state government, IOUs, nonprofits, the private sector. Most attendees are from the PG&E service territory area. Some others from SoCal Edison, and a lot from other areas. 11 people who attended the local energy code session at the SEEC Forum. Thank you for joining us again. Appreciate it. And 51 who haven't. And it looks like most people from the poll are focused on electrification and decarbonization, and then building efficiency and renewables. And some aren't sure yet, but that's okay. And what is a REACH code? One person answered a secret password if you don't know, and then that is the definition that we pulled from localenergycodes.com, which is a great resource. Okay, thank you for taking the poll. I am going to now pass it over to our moderator this morning, Chris Kutch from Southern California Edison. Chris is a mechanical engineer with over a decade of experience in the building science and energy efficiency industry. Currently, he is working for Southern California Edison's Codes and Standards team, supporting Title 24 Energy Code advocacy and local jurisdictions interested in local energy ordinance adoption. So Chris, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Helena. Hi, everyone. As Helena mentioned, my name is Chris Kutch, and I'm the lead for REACH Codes here at SEE. And a quick plug for our REACH Codes program. The REACH Code program is a IOU statewide funded program, and we exist for one reason, and that reason is to support local jurisdictions who are interested in adopting REACH Codes to increase energy efficiency and reduce emissions in their building sector. So, so glad that you guys took the time to join us today. And next slide, please. So today we want to take all of you on a REACH Code journey. So we're going to begin at the summit, where Amy will give us a high-level view of the direction of state policy. And next, Gabe will talk about a path that the CEC has been working on, developing over several years through the Title 24 Building Energy Code to help us get to our state goals. And Misty will then share some tools and resources that are available to all of you on your REACH Code path. And finally, Karin will wrap things up and share some of her experiences with helping cities in the Bay Area who have traveled the REACH Code path and have lived to actually tell about it. So there's some really good takeaways there that we hopefully can all glean from. So as Helena mentioned, if anybody has any questions, please type them into the Q&A chat box. And at the end of each presentation, we're going to try to get to at least one or two of those questions. And if there are any remaining questions, then we're going to save those towards the end of our webinar as time permits. We'll get to those as much as we can. So without further delay, let's jump into our first presentation, and that's Amy. And Amy Ryder, she is the principal consultant for Archemy, who is acting as the REACH Code coordinator for the Building Decarbonization Coalition. She has held positions with local government agencies and consulting firms for more than 15 years, working to optimize local climate change response through education, behavior change, and technology implementation. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Amy Ryder, and I'm here with the Building Decarbonization Coalition, which is a coalition of many different entities, including local governments, but also manufacturers and utilities, both municipal utilities and investor-owned utilities are a part of our growing coalition as well as nonprofits. I think it's fairly self-evident, our interest in this as a decarbonization coalition, being that decarbonization is what we are all about, but that is specific to buildings. And I wanted to give some context today, and I suppose a plug for the half of you that aren't already pursuing electrification or decarbonization reach codes as to really what it is that we're working on, and give you more information about how we're supporting that effort. Go for it, Helena. All right, so just for context's sake, there certainly are emissions that come from many sectors across the state. And this is a slightly oversimplified graph, but we got into this, really our organization was established because there was a missing piece in the solution part of the puzzle for greenhouse gas emissions. And I feel like the big green piece of the pie, transportation, the solution was fairly self-evident and moving the market in the right direction, whereas buildings, the 26% was fairly not interesting, that's not the right word. It really didn't have a central point for everyone to work together in that same way. That the coalition now, we're trying to really fill that particular gap. And there's been so much interest from local governments that they brought me on to help support local governments and kind of coordinate. We'll talk a little bit more about what cities are doing across the state momentarily, but just wanted to give you the context that we're really trying to get at this blue piece of the equation. Go ahead. And so really where that comes from is we looked at the goal of decarbonization, and we've effectively figured out that we know how to clean up the electricity grid. The electric grid in general has a trajectory of downward trend of emissions and a planned zero carbon grid by 2045 per state mandate under SB 100. And when we looked at the total emissions profile of doing that, we were a little perturbed because it left all of these blue gas bars in the mix. And so the solution that seems self-evident to those of us who have been working on this problem is, well, let's take gas out of the equation, at least in new construction, and then eventually looking at electrifying buildings across the board. And so that's really what this graph is intended to tell, that story, is in order to get to zero emissions, electricity is the answer that we have in front of us today. Go ahead. And so this is, again, an oversimplification, but we're saying that decarbonization at the moment looks like electrification in the building industry. Next slide. And I'm not going to go into too much detail around the other benefits here. Happy to do that in the question and answers, but just in the sake of time, there are many studies we can cite about why we're seeing co-benefits and what that really looks like. But really showing that, especially on a life cycle basis, but also on a first cost basis, there are definite savings to be had in all electric construction. There is an equity piece related to that cost, as well as the health impacts are really quite staggering when we get into the details there in terms of eliminating indoor air pollution, and that many of us, including myself, just weren't aware of quite the extent of when we started this work. Certainly the climate benefit is how we got there. And then safety, I think, can't be under quantified either. So happy to talk more about that, but those are really some of the other benefits we're seeing for electric buildings all around. Go ahead. And one of the things that's most exciting about this is that local governments actually have the power to influence buildings. It's not true of agricultural cars in the same extent. And so we are working with roughly 50 jurisdictions around the state who are looking to adopt some form of code that starts to shift the needle towards electrification. And we have 7 already who have done some form of code adoption. and there are different flavors of ways to electrify the code for new construction. They are all new construction, however, and all for the 2019 code cycle. So there's lots of momentum here, and we are here to help. So we'll talk more about what services are available, and many of the folks on the call here today are part of that support equation because so many jurisdictions are going through this process. It's taken a village, and yet we're getting there, and I'm very excited to be part of that process. And hopefully we have more of you joining as a result of this conversation. Go ahead. And so I just wanted to put up some information here. The Building Decarbonization Coalition, again, is the organization I'm working with, but we have a team effort through the Zero Emission Buildings Task Force where we're offering support for local government staff in concert with NRDC and Sierra Club, as well as many of the folks who are going to be on the rest of this panel today. So my contact information is here if you don't get to ask your question during the chat, or if we need to follow up later.
All right, thanks, Amy. I do see one question on the Q&A chat box. This is from an anonymous attendee, and I can read it real quick. We do have some time. How are electric buildings cleaner from a life cycle perspective? Are you accounting for the hazardous waste generated by solar panels and batteries? Currently, there's no way to recycle these. Further, are you accounting for the fact that these are manufactured in China, which has no environmental controls, and shipped?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Certainly, we are looking primarily at the operational emissions, and so we're talking about the cleanliness of health inside the buildings as well as the grid itself. And life cycle emissions should not be ignored. I completely think that's an important point. There are increasingly more options for reuse of batteries, especially in terms of purposes for grid stabilization and other uses. I'm not familiar with what's happening with solar panel disposal, partly because I don't know that we're disposing of them at this point. But certainly excellent points and something to take into consideration. Thank you for your question.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to our next presentation. So Gabriel Taylor is a licensed professional engineer at the California Energy Commission. He is currently the staff lead for demand optimization, healthcare efficiency, and REACH codes in the Building Standards Development Office. Mr. Taylor is also the Energy Commission representative to the Governor's Sustainability Working Group, a role that he has held for nearly a decade. So I'll hand it off to you, Gabe.
Good morning. Thank you very much. As Chris mentioned, my name is Gabriel Taylor. I am the lead staff engineer for local REACH codes within the Building Standards Office here at the California Energy Commission. State level policy is important, but I think we all know that real change and progress happens locally. It takes a lot of hard work to turn good ideas into successful programs and then into meaningful action. And my job is to try to bridge the gap between our current strong state policy and your local work to address climate disruption. Next slide, please. So I'd like to cover three things this morning. First, I'd like to give you a little background and history on the California Energy Commission to help you understand our mission and our motivations. And second, I'll describe the Energy Commission's role in local REACH code development. There's been a lot of misunderstandings there, so I'll give an overview here, and I encourage everybody on the call to contact me if you have any need for further clarifications. And third, I want to summarize a few state-level policies to help provide some context for the work that we're all doing here. Next. The California legislature created the Energy Commission in the mid-1970s in response to an energy crisis. Most people are aware of the oil crisis in the early 1970s and very public gasoline shortages, but California was wrestling with another crisis about the same time, an electricity crisis. The state's utilities and the legislature's own research predicted massive per capita electricity demand growth, as well as continued rapid population growth. Proposed solutions include building more than 40 new nuclear power plants along the coast. That's about one nuclear power plant every 20 miles. This here is a picture of Diablo Canyon in construction. Predictions also included much higher electricity rates, potential rationing, and even rolling blackouts. The result of that crisis was the Warren-Alquist Act, which created a new agency tasked with the conservation and development of the state's energy resources. Next. Our mandate was and remains to ensure a reliable and economic supply of energy for California. The California Energy Commission was created by an act signed by a conservative governor and then was implemented by a much more progressive governor, who some of you are probably familiar with. We consider not only the purely monetary costs of our energy supply, but all costs, such as the environmental and social impacts of energy consumption. As a core responsibility, the legislature required the Energy Commission to develop statewide minimum energy efficiency standards for building design and construction. The legislature also constrained the existing authority of local jurisdictions to adopt their own building energy code. The legislature required that local building energy codes must save more energy than the statewide minimum code, and further that local jurisdictions must consider the cost effectiveness of their actions. Next. The section of code we're talking about here is California Code of Regulations, Title 24, which is the building standards in general, Part 6, which is the Energy Code. That's the only part that the Energy Commission focuses on, and Part 11 to some extent, but Part 6 is really what we're here to focus on. Next. The Energy Commission's role in local REACH code adoption is primarily administrative. We ensure that local codes comply with the law. The Energy Commission has adopted regulations to define and make specific this process. Title 24, Part 1, the administrative section of the building code, outlines these regulations that we've adopted. Our regulations focus on the two requirements that are in the law. Do the local REACH codes result in energy savings? And did the local governing body address cost effectiveness? Our regulations then require that we post the complete application for a 60-day public review, and note that beginning next year, in 2020, the length of that review can be as short as 15 days. The Commission will have the authority to determine how long that review should be. But until the end of this year, until the end of 2019, that review will be required to be 60 days. Next. Oh, back one, please. The process has three basic parts. Local staff development, local jurisdictions develop the proposal, and this is where the vast majority of the work happens. The Energy Commission is available during that process to provide consultation based on our decades of writing building energy code and to help ensure the proposal is successful. This is optional, but we encourage you to contact us early during your development process so that we can help. We can put you in touch with other agencies that are working on similar proposals or nonprofits. There's just a lot of resources out there, and we're eager to help you. And finally, you go through your local public adoption process. This usually is the final step is a vote by a city council or commissioners or some such. Next. The Energy Commission's process here in blue is fairly straightforward. If you can get through your own local process, the state process will be quite simple. Our process starts with that local resolution. Our formal process starts with that local resolution, which you send to us along with your packet that you've the work you've already done. There are three steps. The public review follows once we can ensure that you've submitted all the proper documentation. And during that time, the Energy Commission staff will confirm that your code results in an energy savings. That's our primary legal requirement. And then finally, at the end of that 60 days, once we confirm that the measure both saves energy and that it includes a cost-effectiveness analysis, it will be placed on the consent calendar of an Energy Commission business meeting. After the Energy Commission approves your ordinance at the business meeting, you are clear to move on to the Building Standards Commission and to enforce your measure as normal, as with any local ordinance for buildings. Finally, I'd like to summarize some of the state policy that provides strong context for the work that we're doing. Next, please. The legislature has passed numerous bills relating to climate disruption and renewable energy over the past few decades, and the current session continues that trend. Here are two examples of the strong state support you have for your climate action, but keep in mind there are many other examples. First is SB 100, which Amy already mentioned. This is the new Renewable Portfolio Standard bill passed last year. This is not the first RPS bill that the state of California has adopted. We've set quite a few, and we've met all of them thus far. Electricity in California is currently more than 34% renewable, exceeding our 2020 goal. This was our most recent previous goal, which was 33% by 2020. We met that more than a year early. If you include our large hydro facilities, over half our electricity is zero carbon. SB 100 sets a new mandate for 100% zero carbon electricity by 2045, with strong interim steps of 60% renewable by 2030 and 50% renewable just over 5 years from now, leading to a steady reduction in carbon emissions from electric loads. Next. Over the past decade, we've seen not only a rapid decline in the cost of renewable energy, but at the same time a surge in political and public support to address the climate crisis. When the forces of politics and the market push in the same direction, it's not surprising to see massive change and growth. California is now home to many of the largest renewable generation facilities in the world, and combined with increased distributed rooftop solar, we can see rapid growth of renewable generation in recent years. And due to SB 100, that trend will continue into the future. Next, please. Another example of strong state policy support for decarbonization is AB 3232, which was also passed just last year. It requires the California Energy Commission to report on how to decarbonize all buildings, including both residential and commercial buildings. It's a research bill, but it is within an extremely tight timeline. We are required to report to the legislature every year with a goal barely a decade away. The proceeding at the Energy Commission will gather all stakeholders focused on building decarbonization and empower both decision makers and government and industry with a roadmap to address building emissions. This proceeding will push many of the technologies and policies you are considering for local REACH codes to the state level. But your REACH codes are the first step to bring those statewide solutions. Next, please. The stability of our electric grid is still currently maintained largely with large natural gas power plants. And getting past 60% renewables will require significant investment in new infrastructure. We're transitioning from an electric grid where generation responds to demand to a grid where generation happens when the wind blows and when the sun shines. To successfully build that grid, demand must respond to supply. When addressing this, it is critical that we ensure customer quality of service, however. Many loads can be optimized to minimize their impact on the grid without reducing customer service. Next, please. I like the framework for demand optimization and demand response proposed by Lawrence Berkeley Labs a few years ago. Shape, shift, shed, and shimmy. These are 4 different types of demand management or demand optimization. Shape is long duration changes in energy consumption patterns so that the energy consumption matches the supply. Shift is automated demand management over days or hours where you have automated controls of devices so that you minimize impact on consumers, but you also minimize the impact of that consumption on the grid. Shed is traditional demand response that you may have heard about. This is curtailment in emergency situations or potentially just for economical considerations, and this is simply turning off loads. And finally, shimmy is a relatively new style of demand optimization. This is short duration demand changes on the order of minutes or seconds even that provide synthetic inertia to help maintain the voltage and the frequency of the grid. By optimizing and automating loads where beneficial, we can reduce the need for new grid upgrades, reduce the cost of new renewables, and ensure that building electrification results in real carbon reductions. And further, we can achieve all of this without harming customer satisfaction or consumer preferences. Next, please. The takeaway here is that you have strong state-level support for your efforts to address climate disruption. Decarbonization and electrification are in sharp focus here in Sacramento, and we at the Energy Commission are here to help. Next. California produces only 1% of global climate pollution. We cannot solve the climate crisis on our own, but we have both the economic strength and the political willpower to lead. Our goal is to develop the technologies, policies, and markets for responding to climate disruption and offering those solutions well beyond our borders. But the real solutions will be tested and proven at the local level first. I'm committed to working with each of you to ensure that your efforts are successful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabe. So we got a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to pick the ones that I think pertain to your presentation. So the first one, Michael Winkler. We in Arcata have a REACH code under the 2016 code. We have adopted two formal goals. One, require all electric new construction starting in 2020, phase out natural gas throughout Arcata by 2035, and shut down the natural gas pipeline network by that date. What are state level plans to phase out natural gas? Can you speak to that?
I'm not aware of any formal strong state level plans to phase out natural gas, although that's a bit beyond REACH code, so there may be something I'm unaware of that I'm not able to speak to. I would reference back to both the two examples I gave of existing legislation, and there are many other examples of legislative actions and policies to increase electrification, to increase renewable generation and whatnot. But the issue of natural gas itself is a much larger issue than just REACH codes. Within this context, however, I want to emphasize that we're to use a sports analogy, we're the quarterback throwing a ball to not where the receiver is, but where the receiver will be. We have to get decarbonization in the buildings, electrification in the buildings, and decarbonize the electric grid at the same time, moving both of those balls forward, moving both of those tasks forward so that we can get to the end point as quickly as possible. We can't wait for one to be done in order to start the other task. So in terms of the REACH codes that Arcata adopted in 2016, you will need to bring those. I believe the resolution that we issued for that code probably says that that's specific to the 2016 code. So to have that effective going forward, you need to bring that back to us, but that should be a fairly simple process. So please do contact me concerning that one so that it continues to be legal to enforce that, and we can do a little more research offline.
All right, next question. Is there a list of consultants that can perform the cost effectiveness analysis that is necessary to secure the required certification from the California Energy Commission for local jurisdictions to adopt local codes that affect electrical energy efficiency?
This is a great opportunity to clear up a common misunderstanding. The Energy Commission does not approve the local cost effectiveness determination. Our requirement under the Public Resources Code is simply to ensure that the local jurisdiction considered cost effectiveness in their process. Generally speaking, that requires that the local jurisdiction include a reference to the cost effectiveness analysis that they're using in their public adoption process, and then include it in their submittal to us for public posting. But we do not approve your cost effective analysis, nor do we analyze it. Informally, during your process, I can certainly advise you a little bit on the cost effective analysis that you're using. The CASE team and the Energy Decarbonization Coalition, the Building Decarbonization Coalition, would be, I think, well positioned to advise you on specific consultants. I'm certainly not at liberty to recommend certain consultants.
All right, thanks, Gabe. There's several other questions that are on the chat box. We're going to table those for now, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the webinar. But for now, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next presentation. So next up is Missy Bruceri, and she's here representing the IOU REACH Code team. Missy has worked in energy efficiency and demand-side management for more than 20 years. Her experience includes energy efficiency portfolio planning and development, policy analysis, code development and training, and contract negotiation and management. Misty's current focus is on supporting jurisdictions that wish to adopt energy REACH codes. Take it away, Misty.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. As you know, the REACH codes activity is usually limited to a very small handful of local governments. So I am very excited to see that there's so much interest and so many more jurisdictions that are now recognizing that REACH codes are actually can be a very effective tool to help you influence and guide your local development and how things move forward. So thank you all for making the time to attend today. even though passing a REACH code can take a bit of time and effort, as Gabe noted, local governments are much more nimble than the state, and REACH codes provide an opportunity for a local jurisdiction to act now rather than waiting for 3 or more years for things to be incorporated into the next state code cycle. So I know there's a lot of folks out there right now that have never led the REACH code adoption process, and so you may be feeling a little overwhelmed, but I want to just make sure to point out that there are a lot of people out there that are available to help you. You're not alone in this as we go through it, including both your colleagues and, as Amy mentioned, the village that's available. That it consists of a lot of people on this call as well as others that are actually funded to support local jurisdictions in their to achieve their goals. So please do keep that in mind. I'm going to go through just a very high level summary of the process of adopting a REACH code, as well as the variety of opportunities that are available for you. Next slide, please, Helena. Okay. This diagram provides a kind of a big picture overview of the REACH code's adoption process. And right now, the average time for the whole process tends to be between 6 to 9 months. That's from beginning to end. Although it may seem right now that it's kind of an all new process, really adopting a local energy ordinance is the same as adopting any other ordinance except for 2 steps. In most cases, as Gabe noted, the ordinance has to be cost effective. There are some exceptions, and we can talk about that at another time, but most of the time it has to be cost effective, and you have to document that, and it requires CEC approval. And thank you for your explanation of that, Gabe. So the process starts with kind of figuring out the general direction and scope. What are you looking at? What is it you'd like to do? Is it buildings, or is it about electric vehicles, process loads? What are you looking at? Then basically, once you figure out your general scope, you need to figure out if those requirements that you're considering need a cost effectiveness study. And if they do, you need to obtain one. As both Chris and Gabe noted, the Codes and Standards program actually can provide many of these studies to you for free. And so I do encourage you to contact us if you have any questions about whether something requires a cost effectiveness study and if one might be available already or in progress. The study can give you a really good idea of the boundaries within which you can work for a REACH code. And it gives you the outside bounds of what's cost effective. And so you kind of get an idea of the different kinds of requirements you can have based on that study. But once you get that study, it's the standard ordinance process. You start doing outreach, you talk to people, you get input and refine the scope of the ordinance and the specifics based on that input. And ultimately, you then start preparing your documents, your staff report, and other supporting documentation, and ultimately introduce that to your council or board for adoption. Usually, once you adopted a code, you would simply file with the Building Standards Commission after that. But again, for energy ordinances, there's that extra step, which is going through the CEC approval process. Right now, it's a little bit timely because it does take 60 days, but that actually will be reduced, as Gabe noted, in 2020, and is actually quite a simple process, especially if you work with the CEC in advance and make sure that you've checked all the right boxes. Now, of course, I show this in a very linear, orderly fashion, but the real process usually is not this linear or straightforward. It usually takes a few turns, a few detours, and a couple of iterative processes along the way. So, but this is generally the ideal process as you move forward. Next slide, please, Helena. Okay. Because the studies are often based on the energy code, they can kind of seem like we provide this very high-powered precision tool, but it's not entirely clear where you should aim or what you should be shooting at. And so we wanted to just give you a few ideas because there are many different options available. So I'm going to give you a few ideas just to stimulate your thought here. I want to note that we do have a document that provides a little bit more in-depth descriptions of each one of these options available on our website. So you can return to that and download that if you like. But I'm just going to go through some basic ideas and some the 5 kind of basic categories that we've identified. Next, please, Helena. The first one is building efficiency and renewables. This is probably the most common type of REACH code that we've been looking at. Those come in a variety of options. There could be a whole building type of REACH code, which is often what we do for new construction. And that is, so we have a couple of those available now. It might be measure specific. Perhaps you're considering just one particular measure, say cool roofs might be one option, or perhaps photovoltaic systems. Could be either way. There's all kinds of different possibilities. In addition, that might impact new and or existing buildings. So the scope is quite variable. Next, please, Helena. Second category we have is energy plus water savings. I think everybody on the call is probably familiar with the energy water nexus, wherein if you save water, you also save energy. We have identified several measures, some of which require cost effectiveness analysis, which we've done. Others do not because they don't touch the Part 6 energy code. But we have several different measures that may be appealing that can save both indoor and outdoor water and also reduce the hot water waste for hot water distribution within buildings. Next, please, Helena. Depending on what's happening in your jurisdiction, you may have a lot of occupancies with high process loads. Perhaps commercial kitchens, elevators, escalators are big examples of that. We have one jurisdiction that has a whole bunch of hotels and large campuses in their area, and they are very interested in looking at the kitchens in those areas because they are very high loads for them and a source of many emissions also. Next, please, Helena. And lastly, we have these 2 more kind of information and more like enabling types of structures. The first we're calling electric ready. And that may require installing pre-wiring or perhaps ensuring that the main panel has sufficient capacity for converting to electric in the future. There are some of these kinds of requirements in the state code now, and we are developing some model language to expand on those requirements, as it's often much less expensive to put in some of these enabling measures at new construction than it is at time of retrofit. Okay, and the last category we have is what we call information disclosure. And that generally is either an audit or benchmarking type ordinances. The state has benchmarking requirements for very large buildings right now. And there are several cities that have adopted REACH codes already that have accelerated those requirements, essentially requiring that smaller buildings also benchmark their energy use and disclose that information so that people can make informed decisions. So, like I said, there's a multitude of opportunities out there. These are just intended to be food for thought for you. Just to give you an idea of the variety, and please encourage you to give us a call if you have other ideas or if there's any of these that you'd like to expand upon. There may be others that are thinking the same thing too. Okay, next slide, please. One of the questions we get and we hear quite often is, okay, that's all great, but now what? How do I start? And that, I think, is kind of a common question on any journey. You know, when you first start off, what do I do? How do I get started? So we've got kind of 3 basic steps here that can help you get started. First is gather some data, get some information. What kind of growth are you anticipating in your jurisdiction? What kind of a construction activity do you typically see? Do you have a cap in place that, or other supporting policy documents that can help support you along the way? And then start talking to people, ask questions. Ask everybody questions, get input from both internal and external stakeholders. Who supports you, who opposes you, and why? Can you address their concerns? And if so, begin to address them and start refining the scope. Keep talking to people, do that informal, and begin with informal outreach, and then you start moving into more of the formal outreach realm. But also start networking, find some partners. Partners may be colleagues in neighboring jurisdictions, or they may be folks from this group, from this call, or others that are available to assist you. But I highly recommend you don't go it alone. There's an awful lot of other people out there, and you can really take advantage of others' efforts and leverage those efforts. So, next slide, please. Okay, realize you need to consider a lot of often very different perspectives and needs in your community. And so I just want to point out that REACH codes are not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. While there are advantages to having at least some regional consistency, REACH codes are intended to meet your local needs. And so you can customize them to meet those objectives. For example, if you have a lot, if your jurisdiction has a lot of growth, you are expecting a lot of new construction in the next couple of years, a REACH code is a great way to minimize the impacts of that new development. Another possibility is if your goal of your jurisdiction is to increase density. One opportunity may be to exempt some of the more desirable occupancies, such as accessory dwelling units, to make it easier for them, or maybe reduce requirements or exempt certain types of multifamily projects. There's all different ways you can customize a REACH code, and I just want to make sure that people realize that they are intended to be customized to meet your needs. Next, please, Helena. And lastly, I just want to point you to our localenergycodes.com website. We are in the process of updating and redesigning that site, but in the interim, we have created a page for 2019 resources. We have now, right there, we have some cost effectiveness studies that are already available, as well as other resources. The summary I spoke of earlier is on this page. Other presentations we've given, and also some model language. We have some model ordinance language and a couple other pieces of model language that we've been working on with Building Decarb Group and BayRAN and a couple others. So we've got a great collaborative effort, and there's a lot of resources available for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Misty. I think we have time for one question for you. And so this question is from Keith Munson. It seems to me that a state-led energy compliance with maybe 3 levels of compliance would be a much more cost-effective approach rather than ducting the responsibility and passing it off to every jurisdiction in the state to commit staff and consultants and expense. As with incandescence versus LED lighting, simply mandate the requirement, make it illegal to purchase a non-compliant fixture if it's the direction, rather than adding complexity to specifiers, plan review, contractors, and inspectors. So there's not really a question in there, but I was going to formulate a question out of that. So the question that I came up with that would apply here, I think, is why would it make sense for a local jurisdiction to pursue a REACH code rather than just relying on the state energy efficiency standard?
Well, I think that there are, timing is one of the big advantages for REACH codes. One of the examples we have now is that the state is currently working on the 2022 code, which will become effective in 2023. So once that code is effective, we have 4 years, or three to 4 years in that time frame right now, that there may be many developments that happen in that time frame that the state will not be able to incorporate until the following code cycle, but that local governments can take advantage of now. One example I can give you is in the current code, in the 2016 code. LED lighting actually was one of the examples for outdoor fixtures. When the state adopted the code, there were several, this is 2016 now, there were several areas and types of lighting that were not cost effective at the time. However, because of the rapidly changing market, by the time the code became effective a year and a half later, the prices for a lot of those technologies had dropped and they were cost effective. And we had a couple of jurisdictions then were able to adopt REACH codes that required including those additional cost effective areas. So a local government can act much more quickly than the state. And while I agree that I think the state is probably leading as quickly as they can, they do have a much longer time period.
Chris, this is Gabe. May I chime in as well?
Please.
Sure.
I also want to point out that the local authority to adopt building energy ordinances is based on the California Constitution. This is not something that we at state level have the ability to interfere with. Local jurisdictions have a significant amount of authority over their jurisdiction. And in this context, the only legal pathway we have to interfere with that authority is the Warren-Alquist Act, which was adopted under due process and resulted in a constraint on that local authority for adopting specifically building energy ordinances. And it says that the local jurisdiction, they can adopt it, but they can't enforce it until the Energy Commission ensures that it saves more energy than the statewide minimum and that the local jurisdiction considered the cost effectiveness. So those are the only two constraints we have with this local authority. So in this context, going back to the question, it's not that the Energy Commission or the state is ducking the responsibility. It's more that the local jurisdictions have this authority, and the state is doing everything we can to try to ensure that there's a consistent approach and that the local jurisdictions behave in as responsible a manner and as a informed manner as possible.
Thanks, Gabe. Let's go ahead and transition into our last presentation for today, and a quick introduction for Karin Christensen. And she is the program manager at BayREN's Codes and Standards program. She works with Bay Area local governments to improve energy code compliance and encourage reaching beyond code minimums. She previously worked as a city planner for 19 years, both as a consultant and as local government staff.
Great, thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Make sure it's working.
Yep.
Great, thank you. All right, next slide, please, Helena. I'll dive right in so that we have time for questions, because I see there's quite a few piling up there. The Bay Area Regional Energy Network, or BayREN, is one of 3 regional energy networks in California. We focus on the 9-county Bay Area on saving energy, protecting climate and health. And in terms of REACH codes, our role is really has been to support local governments and to encourage REACH codes, primarily by providing information about REACH codes and the process for adopting them, and also providing opportunities for local government staff to collaborate and to share knowledge. Next slide. The Bay Area has always been a place where there's been a lot of interest in REACH codes. We've had 10 jurisdictions with adopted REACH codes under the 2016 building code. And right now there's over 30 governments here that are actively looking at new REACH codes. One of the main drivers has been looking at REACH codes as a tool to reduce greenhouse gases, but we'll get into some more specifics in a moment. Next slide. So some factors that are helping to drive Bay Area REACH code efforts. There are a couple of model ordinances you all might want to be aware of. One is one that the Zero Emissions Buildings Task Force and the statewide IOU team have collaborated on the localenergycodes.com site, one that Misty mentioned. There's actually an emissions-focused one and an efficiency-focused one, I believe. There are also some Bay Area community choice aggregators that have pulled together model REACH codes for their service areas. And I've put the link to one of those sites there. those, it's also interesting, we've got 3 CCAs here in the Bay Area that are offering $10,000 for local government staff time to cover the effort to bring a REACH code to the council. Another thing that's going on here is there's a real push to adopt REACH codes this year. 2019 really is the year of the REACH code. And that's so that they can be effective for as long as possible. I think it was mentioned before that REACH codes are tied to the state building code, the state energy code, and there's a requirement that local governments have to adopt the state building code every time a new one takes effect, which it will be taking effect January 1st, 2020. So most local governments will be adopting that building code end of October, early November, as shown in the column with the green box on the right of the screen there. For local codes, the process is a little bit longer. So for it to take effect at the same time, it needs to be adopted sooner. If it's adopted at the same time, it would take effect a little later in the cycle. And it's possible to adopt a REACH code at any point during the code cycle. So I think there have been local governments that even this year adopted a REACH code under the 2016 code. So there's not a limit. There's an advantage to doing it early because it's in effect for longer. Next slide, please. So here in the Bay Area, because of those timing options, we've had some jurisdictions who've already held first or second readings of their energy code REACH ordinances. San Mateo, I believe theirs is fully adopted. Menlo Park and Windsor have already had first readings. And outside of the Bay Area, Carlsbad, San Luis Obispo, and Santa Monica, I think, have all had at least one reading. Carlsbad is fully adopted also. And there are other local governments that are planning to introduce ordinances this fall, and some that are just starting to explore the options. So there are many choices. Next slide, please. So I want to just take a few minutes to go over some actual components of Bay Area REACH codes. What we're seeing most commonly is a code that requires code minimum for all electric buildings, coupled with increased efficiency and electric-ready infrastructure for mixed fuel buildings. There are some jurisdictions that are looking at requiring all electric buildings, sometimes for all buildings or for non-residential buildings, or for residential buildings or for municipal buildings. So there's different options there. And I'll get into those in a second. Plus, many jurisdictions are requiring photovoltaics for high-rise residential and non-residential uses. Photovoltaics are required for low-rise residential under the 2019 code, but not for these other uses, and that is something that's very cost-effective. And many jurisdictions are also looking at electric vehicle infrastructure, which is not strictly speaking an energy REACH code, but often it's considered at the same time. So I wanted to mention it. So to give you a sense of some of the variety, I just wanted to focus on the 3 jurisdictions that have had readings so far. San Mateo, as I said, has adopted them, and they are requiring for low-rise, single family and duplexes, and for offices, all electric buildings can be constructed at the code minimum, but mixed fuel would require additional efficiency measures. Multifamily, however, would be at code, and they have some reasons for that, although they are also looking to see whether they want to change that. They also have a photovoltaics section and electric vehicle provisions. Menlo Park has taken a different approach. They've required electric space heating, water heating, and clothes drying, and all electric buildings for non-residential and high-rise residential, as well as some photovoltaics for non-residential and high-rise residential. And the town of Windsor is looking at requiring all electric construction for low-rise residential buildings. So there is some variety, and that just to give you a flavor, and you can find, as those have all been at public meetings, you can find, I'm sure, the staff reports online for those. Next slide. So I wanted to get into some of the lessons learned here, and so that you can learn from our experiences. Next slide. So REACH codes do work best when they fit the local context, as Misty said. We want to target local priorities and policy objectives. So an ordinance that's requiring increased efficiency for office buildings won't accomplish much if there are no new office buildings that are going to be built in that jurisdiction. There are many choices for local governments. One of the easiest ways to look at them is to look at model REACH codes. Those have often templates and other support that are available, so they don't require as much in the way of staff resources. A model REACH code will have a cost effectiveness study that has been based on already. It's also possible to tailor a model REACH code, use it as the base, and then adjust some things as necessary. And you can customize a REACH code. You can develop your own specific jurisdictional REACH code that you particularly want. I did want to note that all REACH codes, because all REACH codes have to be cost effective for the climate zone of their jurisdiction, sometimes a measure that will work in one part of the state won't work in another. So if you're looking at a code that's been adopted elsewhere or a model code from another part of the state, you need to be sure that it will be cost effective where you are and that it will work for you. So it's just something to keep in mind when tailoring or customizing a REACH code. Next slide, please. At the same time, and while it's possible for every city to develop its own unique REACH code, there are some advantages to consistency. And it's definitely worth finding out what nearby jurisdictions might be considering and perhaps trying to work with them. Contractors don't usually work in just one city. They will be working in multiple places. And life will be a lot easier in implementing a REACH code if they're not trying to remember that, like, what we have to do this way for this city and this slightly different way for this city and something completely different for this other city. So compliance, I think, is a lot easier with some consistency. It's also true for local governments. It's easier for them to enforce it if it's consistent, because if staff are going from one city to another, they already are familiar with the REACH code. The staff from one jurisdiction can support each other, folks in another jurisdiction, and people like us at BayRen who are trying to develop materials and trainings to help support our local governments can do that much easier when they have similar types of REACH codes. So there's a balance there between wanting to customize and wanting to be consistent with your neighbors, but at a very minimum, do talk with your neighbors and find out what they're doing and see if you can, find some ways that you can work together and come up with something that's consistent. Next slide, please. If you have an elected or appointed official championing a REACH code, that can make a big difference in the process. If someone has a strong interest in energy or climate or health, and you can educate them about the connections between those issues and REACH codes, you might be able to grow that person into a champion for a REACH code. So it's something to hope for and utilize if you have the opportunity. Next slide. And other important people to keep in mind are your building officials. Sometimes when a discussion starts with elected officials or sustainability staff, the building officials aren't brought in until late in the process. But it's important to realize that the building department is where the rubber is going to hit the road for REACH codes. Building officials are the ones who are going to have to defend the REACH code to applicants. When an applicant comes in and says, wait a minute, why do I have to do this? They're the ones at the counter. They're going to have to figure out how to implement the REACH code, and they may have concerns about time constraints for enforcement. So talk with your building department staff, find out what kind of support they need, what their concerns are, if there are resources you can provide to help address their concerns. Next slide, please. And we've talked about working with officials and building officials and departments, but it's also important to talk with anyone else at your city, planning staff, for example, and anyone else involved with development permitting. They're going to be key for this. For external stakeholders, you want to include everyone, even the people that you'd think won't object. There was one jurisdiction here, I think it was last year, that had its REACH code opposed in the last code cycle because by environmental advocates, because they felt that it didn't go far enough. So talk to your environmental organizations as well. Talk to the advocates. Here in the Bay Area, there has not been a lot of opposition. There's been some pushback by the building industry, so those are definitely folks you want to talk to. And in San Luis Obispo, I know Southern California Gas opposed their proposed REACH code, so any of you in SoCal Gas territory might want to find out what their concerns were and be considering those if you're thinking about a REACH code. Next slide, please. And finally, once you've adopted a REACH code, that's a really big effort. It's something to be proud of, but it's also just a piece of paper until it's been implemented and enforced. So that's why your building department is so important. There are barriers to actually enforcing a REACH code. The time constraints on your building staff, sometimes lack of information or knowledge, especially if there's been a staff change, a lack of support. So if you're championing a REACH code through your process, see if you can help to champion it through the enforcement and implementation as well. Provide information on it, trainings, find out what's needed and see what you can do to get it. And whenever possible, track the results. See if you can regularly take a look and see how well the REACH code has been implemented and what the results have been from the adoption of the REACH code. That makes a big difference. Next slide, please. And so, based on the lessons learned, we just pulled together those REACH code best practices. I'm a little over time, so I'm not going to go through those, but I think we've already discussed them. Next slide, please. And for more information, this is our website. We do have some information on REACH codes on our website as well, and my contact information if you have any questions we don't manage to get to today. Thank you.
Thanks, Karin. Okay, so let's jump into the Q&A chat box, and with our time remaining, we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. If not, then we'll try to find a way to provide follow-up answers to the questions that we can't get to. So the first one is, and I'll open it up to the team, is there funding available to help local governments adopt a local REACH code?
This is Karin. I'll just say, here in the Bay Area, the funding that we've seen has come from, I think, 3 of our community choice aggregators, Peninsula Clean Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, and East Bay Clean Energy, have been providing $10,000 to cover local staff time for bringing a REACH code to the council level. So I don't know if that's available in other parts of the state. This is a new thing this time, so I'm not aware of other sources of funding. I don't know if anyone else is.
This is Misty. I'm not aware of any funding where we pay you, but the Codes and Standards program does provide a lot of services that to help facilitate the adoption and support you. So we can provide technical support, can help answer your questions. Like I said, model language, we can help with presentations, things like that. So there's funding to support that for sure through the Codes and Standards program, and I know also the Building Decarb folks. And Barry.
Okay, great. Another question here. Will 100% electric buildings interfere with the use of tankless water heaters, which generally use natural gas? Tankless water heaters are generally considered to save energy because they don't require a large volume of hot water to be stored, which wastes energy all day long when water is not in use?
So there's been a lot of, this is Gabe Taylor at the Energy Commission, there's been a lot of work on electric heat pump water heaters recently. We had a summit in San Francisco last summer, this is 2018, with virtually all the electric heat pump water heater manufacturers, and the Building Decarbonization Coalition led that, so feel free to chime in, Amy. But there is an opportunity to reduce the cost of decarbonization and of integration of renewables with electric heat pump water heaters. They essentially behave as thermal batteries, so that storage of hot water becomes a benefit rather than a detriment when you are able to shift some of the consumption to times when you have a significant, for example, solar generation, and then integrate that with the larger distribution system and allow them to reduce their load at times when the grid is stressed. So there's a huge opportunity there for the demand optimization that I described. As the primary reason I included it in my slide deck was because of electric heat pump water heaters.
Okay, next question. How will local REACH codes influence electric vehicle infrastructure? Do local REACH codes apply to EV charging stations or just bus fleet charging facilities? So the Title 24 Part 6 generally considers electric vehicle charging to be a plug load. So there's not a real strong direct ability to manage that. That said, again, going back to the demand optimization I mentioned, electric vehicles are the secondary, probably, if not the primary, but behind electric hot water heating, opportunity to balance load, to shift load and shape load in a way that supports the grid but maintains customer satisfaction and quality of service. We have a number of research programs going on here at the Energy Commission. We have an entire division dedicated to transportation policy and programs that is focused very strongly on electric vehicle charging and infrastructure and how that's going to impact the electric grid. So there's a ton of work going on about that. It's a little bit outside the REACH code process as we're discussing here today, although I know that a number of local jurisdictions have adopted local ordinances relevant to electric vehicle charging.
Yeah, this is Karin. I'll just chime in there since I mentioned electric vehicle charging. One of the fine points is that electric vehicle ordinances are classified as green building ordinances rather than as electric or energy REACH codes. So as was said, as Gabe explained earlier, energy REACH codes have those couple extra steps where they need the CEC approval, they need to be cost effective. That's not true for energy REACH codes, that's not true for electric vehicle codes. They are green building ordinance codes, so they're much more like a standard municipal ordinance. And for example, the San Mateo one that was just adopted requires a complete circuit and outlet for electric vehicle charging to be installed for single-family homes, a higher percentage of spaces to be electric vehicle capable for multifamilies, and mandatory electric vehicle equipment installation for non-residential. So I think the question is does it apply to EV charging station or just bus fleet charging facilities? This one applies to electric fleet, it applies to EV charging stations at single-family homes, multifamily dwellings, and non-residential buildings as well. But as we've discussed, it's possible to write a local code in a lot of different ways. So I'm sure there are other options too.
So this is Gabe Taylor at the Energy Commission. I know we're running up on the end of time here, so I did want to say there's a lot of additional questions here. I'm not sure if we have time to get to them, but if you don't get your question answered, please contact me. I'm here at the Energy Commission, and we are eager to help you be successful in your REACH code adoption process. As I mentioned in writing to one of the questions which was posed about why the state doesn't have stronger codes and so that the locals don't have to adopt these REACH codes, this is local authority. We don't have we don't really have an ability to interfere with that authority, with the exception of that cost effectiveness and that energy savings. So my job here is simply to support the efforts, the existing authority that local governments have, and make sure that you have all the resources you need and the information you need to be successful. So pass that back over to Helena.
Thank you, Gabe. And thank you to all of our other speakers and for everyone for participating in this webinar. I do apologize that we didn't get to all your questions, but we will try to see how we can best follow up with folks. And just as a reminder, this webinar is or was recorded and will be shared on the SEEC website that you see on the screen there within this week. So stay tuned for that. We'll send out an update with the recording. But with that, I want to say thank you for participating in this webinar and have a great rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.